Emily and I read Youth Held at the Border, which is a book by Lisa Lee Patel. And it's about immigration and education. And so the first chapter was called Juana, Wigs, Husbands, and Documentation. They first started with an introduction that kind of outlined that this book is a mix of stories, analysis, and data that frames and explains about the lives of immigrant youth and really looks into the ways that they're included and excluded from society, and which is super multifaceted. It talks about lots of different ways of life, whether that's education or family life or money or whatever. So the first chapter focuses on Juana. She's a Haitian immigrant. She came to America as a teenager and went to Boston, which is where the author is based out of. She's studying to be a nurse and support her family, which part of that includes sending money back to Haiti, which a lot of immigrants do, and supports a lot of the Latin American economy. And she ends up marrying an American citizen who's super abusive, but being abused by an American citizen does give her a path to permanent residency. One of the main ideas in this chapter is meritocracy, which really applies, unfortunately, to immigrants that most Americans see as like the American dream as a positive thing. But when immigrants don't succeed because of this meritocracy view, they're seen as not working hard enough. Another aspect discussed in this chapter was mental health. Many immigrants feel depressed because they feel inadequate and unable to succeed, which is another result of meritocracy. A lot of immigrants who are victims of domestic violence won't report the violence like we saw in Aida Hernandez, but it's important to report that because, especially for them, it can lead to residency. And one last point was that immigrants with strong ties to American citizens are most likely to get residency papers.
So chapter 2 was called Lena and Schooling. And this chapter focused on two main characters. The first one's Lena. And so she moved at 16 years old, and her main goal was to basically be a good student and to do well and to study and become someone, is what she says in the book. And so Lena, when she turns 18, she becomes undocumented, but she takes several jobs, babysitting, cooking, cleaning, just to make ends meet. So in this chapter, they also talked about the Immigration and Nationality Act amendments of 1965. And so what this did was it abolished national origins, and it basically established like a categorical preference. But then in the chapter, we also learned about Matthias. And so Matthias is actually one of Lena's fellow peers, and he's also a very well-rounded person, very highly educated, a really good student. But we learn when Lena overhears a conversation with Matthias and an English teacher that he wants basically a letter for a school-sponsored service trip to go to the Dominican Republic. But overall, the main idea of this chapter is that there are specific gender roles and occupational expectations based on gender with the undocumented status. So basically, gender and job is related to undocumented status, and it all goes together. But it also talked about how it can hinder students, especially females, from performing well and advancing academically.
The third chapter was called Double Consciousness, and it again focused on Matthias, who is a student at the high school that the author mainly worked in. And after things like the letter that Emily talked about that helped him go on a service trip, he received a full scholarship to go to a elite private school. And a lot of this was due to the fact that he was able to garner support and experiences that made his application look really good, which, like Emily talked about, was partially due to gender roles and that he wasn't expected to babysit like Juana and Lena were. This chapter talks also about two girls named Yeveline and Rydalyn, who were on a service trip to the Dominican Republic, and one of the girls, Rydalyn, says, "Wow, I'm black," after tanning, and Yeveline, who is of darker skin color, tries to talk about how that bothers her and makes her feel inferior. So this kind of plays into an idea by W.E.B. Du Bois, this idea of double consciousness, which, quote, notes the ways in which African Americans are unrelentingly forced to see themselves through racist eyes of their oppressors and societal structures that deny them opportunities. Which basically means that these people, these minorities, are seeing themselves as they see themselves and through the eyes of the people who oppress and discriminate against them. This is primarily perpetrated through things that are called microaggressions, which are small acts that add up to be really hurtful towards people of minority, and this leads to diminished views of oneself, which makes immigrants feel oppressed and devalued because they're seeing themselves through the eyes of other people who are devaluing them. The chapter also talks about how racism is institutionalized, that it's not just one random person, but that our culture is set up in a racist way. And some examples of this are school to prison pipelines for minorities, for minority groups that do not receive very much federal funding, and then they don't achieve highly in comparison to their white counterparts. Incarceration rates are higher in minorities, and there's also a higher risk of deportation.
So the fourth chapter is called The Single Story of Adolescence. And so in this chapter, we also see the same character again, but it gives us more information about his past and specifically related to his father. So his father actually left the family just 3 days before he was born to travel to the US. And so once the father travels to the US, he remarries, starts a new family, but basically cuts off all communication with his former family and specifically his son. And so during the time Matthias moves to the US, he loves school, as we covered earlier, but he also basically used school, we learn, as an escape from his father. And so then Matthias goes to receive help, but in this chapter we learn problems with intervention practices. And so one of the biggest problems we learn is that most healthcare providers for intervention practices are native born to the US. So it's hard sometimes for them to relate to immigration and immigrants as they don't have the firsthand experience. Another problem we learn in the second quote is this model of mental health support focuses on intervention with emphasis on youth due to their adjustment difficulties during their adolescent development. So it doesn't really have the full broad scope that's necessary and needed for intervention practices.
The next chapter, called Chapter 5, which is titled Lost in Translation, focuses on a student named Rebecca, who's an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. She lives with her mom and her stepdad, who's also an immigrant from the DR. And the main point of this chapter is that being an undocumented immigrant often prevents students from attending college because they can't provide social security numbers and identification, which means that they have to pay international tuition, which is super expensive, often a lot higher than out-of-state tuition, which is already expensive. And so this is a huge limiting factor that results in immigrants, and especially undocumented immigrants, not being able to go to college and get higher education, which then doesn't help their life trajectory, and a lot of them, being uneducated, will end up working in service professions, which is totally respectable jobs, but doesn't provide a lot of opportunity for upward mobility. Another idea talked about in this chapter, hinted at in the title, is that immigrant children are often the interpreters for their families. And the interpreter of a family, the one who's translating things from English to Spanish or whatever language it may be, kind of has the power because they're the ones who are translating this knowledge and communicating the knowledge from one language to another. And so when the child is the translator, it throws off the power balance of the family because the child is being thrown into a role of more power because they're the ones who are having the knowledge to translate and give to their parents. This chapter also addresses the idea of the single narrative talked about in chapter 4. And this idea of children translating and playing a different role in their families doesn't fit into the single narrative of American child development, where children can't report information correctly and they are always biased. And that's not true for children who are tasked with being translators at a young age.
So the next chapter is called There's Learning and Then There's Schooling. And so in this chapter, we're introduced to Mr. Knox. He's a teacher who really has a heart for his kids and loves them deeply, but he doesn't really seem to fully understand what they've been through. And he doesn't just seem to grasp their past experiences. So when he's teaching and giving assignments, he doesn't really take this into account. And so it leads some of his students to basically simply be a student and not to learn. In this chapter, we learn that learning is different from being a student. And the chapter defines to learn is to understand and incorporate and apply knowledge, whereas to be a student is to simply meet the teacher's expectations. So we learn the importance of both students and teachers fully understanding how both students and teachers need to master academics and life success. So good teachers are constantly learning and learning of their students as a whole. So not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. For instance, immigrant children, their past, what they've been through, their fears. And so we learn basically that you need to have both learning and teaching to make a good classroom setting.
The next chapter, chapter 7, is called There's a New Sheriff in Town, and it is built around the idea of a new principal coming to the school that Patel, the author, usually works in. So the old principal was Mr. Oeda. He is really student focused. He focuses on the students in his school before he's thinking about his school report card and test scores and things like that. And he does challenge them academically and push their teachers to push them, but he prioritizes relational equity with his students. He wants to care about them and for them to know how he cares about them. And there's a saying that goes, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And Mr. Oeda really builds on that. His leadership is built on knowing and supporting his students and his teachers. But he gets another job opportunity, and a new principal comes to Lincoln High. That's Mrs. Corey. She's kind of like a rescue principal coming to get the scores up and improve the school's school report card. And she is an immigrant, or was an immigrant, but her immigration story is really different and doesn't match the stories of the immigrants at Franklin High. And so she really misunderstands them and is too focused on the numbers and doesn't take into account the lives of the students, like Emily talked about with Mr. Knox and how important that was. One of the points in this chapter is that true learning and education happen when students are focused on and cared about and prioritized, and that when relationships are at the forefront and teaching comes second to caring about the students as humans. And stressing teachers and students about school report cards can negatively impact the students' true learning. Even if they're doing well on scores, they may not be learning about life and learning things that are sticking, and this impacts their lives. And finally, legislation that comes from the higher ups in the government is not always focused on improving the students' lives and their livelihood as it is about funding and test scores and the school success rather than the success of the individual humans who are inside the school.
So next, the chapter we have is called You Must Be This Tall to Ride This Ride. And basically in this chapter, we learn of two people who come from very similar life experiences, but they end up with a completely different result. So first we have Eric, and he is detained for being undocumented. And when he's detained, though, this catches the attention of the media. So he was at Harvard, he was a student there, highly educated, very smart, And during his time being detained for being undocumented, a senator intervenes to get him a work permit to stay. Well, on the other hand, we learned of another character, Gene, who's a student at Franklin, and he was also revoked. His documentation was revoked, so he was made an illegal immigrant. But however, as we see Eric, he becomes documented and allowed to stay, whereas on the other hand, we have Jean who does not. And they both are highly educated. They both knew English, took APs, passed tests. But basically, the idea in this chapter is how is it okay that one can have a similar instance and be declared illegal or undocumented, whereas the other gets to be free. And the idea is what makes them so different when in fact the story leading up to their result is very similar.
The ninth chapter is called The Devil You Know, and it focuses on a young man named Eduardo who goes to Franklin High, and he's undocumented and wants to go to college, but his mom objects to him applying and attending community college because she wants him first to just save money just in case something happens, and also not to put himself in situations that could reveal his status to other people, status as undocumented. So this chapter looks at some of the social barriers to undocumented students being able to attend college. One of them, like we talked about before, is the cost. The international tuition rates are super expensive, and FAFSA does not apply to undocumented students, and there aren't many scholarships that you can get as an undocumented student that are renewable and significant. Another big one that this chapter focuses on is the fear of exposure, that other people will find out that you're undocumented and that you'll be reported and deported. Undocumented students often lack time to be able to study because they have to work so hard at low paying jobs to support themselves and their families, and sometimes families don't approve because it's not what they know, that's not what they're used to. And so teachers and educators and people really need to be careful in assuming that every student should go to college, because that's not the case. There are many aspects of a student's life which are important, and every student is not meant for college. And so it's important to keep that in mind when you're asking students what they're going to do next. Maybe asking like, what are your plans for the future instead of where you're going to college. And when they say, I'm not going to college, you say, that's really cool. Like, what's your life plan? Instead of, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're not going to college. It's important to be sensitive to people's backgrounds. And Mr. Perez does this really well. He recognizes that their daughters, sons, translators, breadwinners, childcare workers, brothers, sisters first, before their students. And he treats them well in the context of all of their roles first. And this is really important for teachers to do.
So in the next chapter, we meet two characters. Well, we've already met the one, but we also meet Francisco. And in this chapter, basically, we learn that Iardo has worked over 45 hours a week in studies for his classes. So he's not only working well over full time, but he's also doing studies in order to pay for college on top of that and doing it well. So he learns, and we learn that he believes education is the way to gain a productive life and to be successful. So during his time in school, he transfers to a different community college and receives in-state tuition. He didn't have enough money to meet the requirements to stay there, so he applies for financial aid. But during this time, we learn that he does not get the financial aid he needs because the system doesn't view him as the typical American, is what the book says. And so he's not that typical student. And this one-size-fits-all idea doesn't work well in his case, as he does not receive the money he needs, even though the chapter clearly shows that he put in the work and the effort and was doing his best to do this. On the other hand, we learn of Francisco. This is his father. So his father had left the family and remarried, and they had 2 children together. And so during this time, Iardo wanted his father to sponsor him for citizenship, but the father had refused over and over. But after a while, and after the father's new wife had talked to him, he decided to sponsor him when he was 20. And so eventually, long story short, he is issued a green card because the father fulfilled the agreement.
So the 11th chapter, there's a lot of information from this one, but it starts with the author talking about an experience she had living in a primarily white neighborhood in Boston, and she says she feels uneasy that the higher cost of living has come because of the white people have come and kicked out unintentionally, but truly, a lot of low-income families. And this is an example of socioeconomic issues which are relevant between different races in Boston and the whole country. And so she's at a barbecue and she's talking to a woman, and the woman tells a story about her daughter who was on a bus and is accused of being Mexican, and responds to that. And though her daughter is not Mexican, she's half Puerto Rican, she says that she would be proud to be Mexican. And then the mom goes on to tell another story about how she refers to a cleaning girl as, oh, I'm just going to hire a Mexican girl. And there's a lot of dissension between these two stories, that they don't represent a view of immigrants well, not the same view. And so this author looks around the party, and there are other people listening to the story, and no one else looks confused at how this woman could have two different views about immigrants. But it's just kind of emphasizing that there are different views that people take, and that it's not always fair to different immigrants, even within one person's story. So then the author goes on to talk about Rebecca, who is a girl at Franklin High, and she uses a friend's social security number, or a fake one, and is not fully compensated for her work. And because she's using someone else's social security number, doesn't get her tax refund and things like that, even though she's the one doing the work. And this is the life for a lot of undocumented immigrants, and some documented immigrants. They're not treated fairly. They don't get what they deserve, even when they're working hard. And so Rebecca kind of looks at this and is tuned into the way that immigrant economies function within immigrant populations, and it's sometimes different than the way that they do in the populations that we're accustomed to. And she even takes it so far to say that undocumented immigrants are villainized, especially when it comes to looking at issues like crime and Social Security, and especially by administrations like the Trump administration. And another point where things don't really line up is in a bake sale she sees, where there's a bake sale for Haiti, which is cool that they're raising money for Haiti, but there's no political education being put in mind. They're just sending money, which is helpful, but it's not changing the culture of the way that we look at other countries. And so I really feel like the author's calling people to be aware of how their actions perpetrate human rights issues and black markets, which harm humans worldwide, and immigrants on our own soil. And so these attitudes and the way that we think about things are hurting people here, even when we don't see that. And then finally, the author points out that to bring change, you have to address the exclusion and not just raise $100 for Haiti or whatever, but you really have to address the culture of exclusion against minorities, and also the exploitation which happens around the world and here, that's rooted in inequalities and poor labor conditions.
So in the last chapter, it touches on points that were brought up in the previous chapters, and it compares two lives of two students, both of which are 19, and they lived in Boston. And so you see where one works, the other goes to buy food. And so basically the idea here is, once again, that two daily routines can be very, but at the same time very different. And so you see that these routines are similar, as they go to the same places, they both go to school, but however, one is an immigrant from Guatemala and the other isn't. But long story short, in this chapter, the author basically says that I hope you have been able to think of different ideas, different perspectives, and seen through her book just different point of views and ways of thinking on issues of immigration. And so the author leads the reader with a note saying that she hopes her efforts fill a differential inclusion in order to change those conditions that rest upon each of us. And so through the book, it seems that she really just wanted us to look at immigration as a whole, whether it's from a legal political standpoint or a personal standpoint from people's stories one-on-one. And she just hopes that we look at it throughout.